Oh, it's so nice to see some people that I know and people that I don't. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jessica Helfand, one of the founders of Design Observer. We have been doing these events all through the pandemic, given that we were missing each other and missing seeing each other's work. So this is an opportunity to do just that. I am so thrilled to be joined today by an old friend, former classmate, brilliant book designer, and very kind soul who has an amazing story to tell. Daphne Geismar has produced a book that she has been talking about for many years, and with the help of her wonderful publishers at David Godine, has created this magnificent book, which, if you look in the chat, you will see is on sale. They've given you all an opportunity to buy this book at 20% discount, which I suggest that you do because really you have nothing to lose and everything to gain by having this little thing to hold in your hands. Before I introduce Daphne, who I think I just did introduce actually, I just want to say this is the last event we'll be doing this summer because you all have better things to do, like reading Daphne's book and going to the beach. We'll resume in the fall when we look forward to seeing you all again. And without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Daphne, who is going to tell you about this great book and really anything else she wants to do. I'm giving her the floor. She's going to share her screen. Welcome, Daphne Geismar.
Hello. Um, so, so I'm actually just sending my husband a link to this because I know he was going to try to get on and I don't see him. Nice to see you here and so many familiar faces. Thank you so much, Jessica and Betsy, for inviting me. It's really an honor to talk with you about our shared love of books and bookmaking. So as Jessica mentioned, today I'm going to talk about the making of my book, Invisible Years. Along the way, I'll show you a few other projects that informed my book. My work on Invisible Years has been a 15-year journey during which I discovered the life stories of my parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles. They were Jewish families living fulfilling lives until 1940, when the Germans occupied the Netherlands and the Nazi civilian government established anti-Jewish laws that slowly drove them into isolation by stripping them of their rights, their jobs, education, friendships, and possessions, and then demanded that they report for deportation. Defying this order, my grandparents made the decision to go into hiding, making the agonizing choice to send the children separately in order to increase their chance of survival. Invisible Years is a kaleidoscope of family members speaking to one another when in reality they couldn't, and we are transported into their world as they encounter the worst and best of humankind. And now let me share my screen. Okay. In early 2006, my aunt received a phone call from a colleague. She said to her, "You're a D'Souza, right?" Her colleague had just seen an ad in a newspaper for Dutch immigrants in Israel placed by a church in Rotterdam. They were looking for relatives of Chaim and Fifi D'Souza. The congregation wanted to invite the descendants of two Jewish families who were hidden in the Bride Plain Church during the German occupation to their 75th anniversary celebration. This was the first I heard about my grandparents hiding in the attic of the church. 11 of my family members went to the Netherlands to attend the celebration. On the left is the sanctuary and organ pipes, and on the right, the attic where my grandparents, Chaim and Fifi D'Souza, were hidden behind and above the organ pipes. After hiding in the attic for almost 2 years, and shortly before liberation, there was a Nazi raid on the church. My grandfather Chaim wrote a detailed account of the terrifying event and included this drawing of their hiding place. It shows the ladder and trap door to their hidden attic and other important details related to the raid. This is an excerpt from his diary on the raid. I hear someone walking through the church. There's the sound of multiple footsteps. Carefully, I hold the edge of the opaque green curtain against the wall and use my finger to create a small crack. only to grow rigid with fear at that very moment. On the podium below me, between the pews of the elders and deacons, at a distance of perhaps 4 meters, there are 2 green police walking around, searching everything. And then comes the stage of paralysis, the sense that all is lost. When I was at the church 61 years later, during a moment that I had alone in the organ loft, I pulled back the curtain to look into the nave, just as my grandfather had when he saw the Nazi police searching between the pews. There's still a small chance. Now the super heavy ladder has to be raised. One slip and that's the end, for the Germans are already below me in the foyer, from which we are separated by thin slats of wood. They're coming up the stone staircase to the little storage space. I close the trap door and cover the cracks with a cloth, and a German hand is already at the door of the storage space. I remain standing on the trap door, completely motionless. Just before the raid, Chaim placed the lunch dishes on this brick wall. This is where he was standing in the dark after he raised the ladder. After what seemed to him like an eternity, the sexton's wife knocked on the trapdoor to tell him the Nazis had left. When they turned on the light, they saw a spoon teetering on the edge of this brick wall. If it had fallen when the Nazi police were standing below, my grandparents and their rescuers would have been murdered. This is the Reverend Garrett Grillenberg-Worth and his wife, Gerda, who saved the lives of my grandparents. My grandparents were complete strangers to them. At the celebration in 2006, we met the grandchildren of the pastor. They invited my family to dinner at their home in Amsterdam, and over dinner, asked my mother and aunt to tell more about the war. And that's when we started to hear stories that we hadn't heard before. That night, we talked about collecting those stories and making a book. As fate would have it, I spent most of my career making books. Much of my work has been for art museums. This work inevitably influenced design choices that I made in Invisible Years. So I'm going to show you just a few of these connections. This is a book of Peggy Preheim's work for the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum. Peggy is an extremely private person, so I spent time with her getting to know her and her art. Over multiple studio visits and lunches, Peggy started showing me objects and books and writings that inspired her, and we talked about how this material influenced her incredibly detailed work about the human experience. I took pictures of the artifacts and asked Peggy to write from the pictures. The result was a visual biography of Peggy's life and her creative process. And with this, I discovered the potential of telling a story through artifacts. After working on this data book, I understood how contextualizing a story with historical facts and cultural references adds meaning. This book for the National Gallery of Art organizes the work of 46 artists by the 6 cities they worked in. Each city is a chapter. The chapters are defined by color tabs on the foredge of the book. At the end of the book, the 6 cities come together in a 40-page chronology that cites the experiences of the artists, as well as the social and political occurrences that were relevant to the movement. Here, the 2 spreads at the bottom of the screen show a conversation with 5 voices. I thought back to this project for the Princeton University Art Museum as I worked with the 8 narrators' voices in Invisible Years. On these pages, the visual structure reveals the rhythm of the discussion between the curator and 4 scholars. Reproducing maps in a book is tricky because they are large and detailed. When I started working on this book for Harvard University Art Museums, I spent time in the archive looking at the photographs and ephemera to include in the book. One object was this beautiful and informative map that shows the number of immigrants by state from 1892 to 1903, including country of origin and occupation. I decided to print the map on the inside of a folded jacket. This way, it's close to actual size and can actually be read. Invisible Years also has a map with important information, as you'll see later. When I was designing the website for the Joseph and Annie Albers Foundation, I thought I could spend the rest of my life learning from the material in the archive. It was their personal letters, notebooks, research notes, interviews, writings, lectures, even teaching plans, and also photographs. I was getting to know the Albers through their papers, which is the same way that I would get to know my grandparents. The section of the Albers site that showcases their art was, of course, incredible to work on. But it is the archive that tells the story of the artist's work and lives. And so it was the archive that captivated me. This is a very good old friend of both Jessica's and mine, Paul Rand, a renowned designer for those of you who don't know him. And Paul once told me that a designer should be able to design anything, that subject matter is insignificant, a problem is a problem. While I understand what he meant, the problems that most interest me are content-based, specifically projects that provide insight into people and societies. For this reason, I started a photography and writing program for teenage mothers. The process of writing was cathartic for the young mothers, and their work was used to educate other teenage girls, teachers, and social workers. Their stories were featured in the New York Times, on public radio, in exhibits, and also presentations. I learned a lot about the power of words and images for literature and art when working on my thesis at Yale. The project was about Direction, a magazine published from 1937 to 1945 as a vehicle for artists and writers to speak out against fascism and social injustice. I discovered the unpublished diaries of the magazine's editor, Marguerite Jader Harris, and interviewed Paul Rand about his provocative designs for the covers of the magazine, which he created when he was in his 20s. While immersed in my thesis, I was also working on an identity design project for which Paul was my advisor. One day, conversations about the Holocaust and identity design merged, and Paul made this remarkable sketch. These experiences and the collaborations as a designer, student, and teacher made it possible for me to make this book about my family's life under Nazi occupation. My colleagues in the museum publishing community have set a standard of excellence that informs the structure, text, and manufacture of Invisible Years. Because of their influence, I knew what to do with the complex stories that started to unfold at the Bright Plain Church. After the church visit back in the United States, my mother led me to an antique desk and opened the bottom drawer. It was filled with letters, diaries, and documents about our family members' experiences during the Holocaust. When I called my cousin Sharon in Israel to tell her about it, she told me that her mother, Judith, had a Holocaust drawer too. And in these drawers, we found the accounts of our grandparents, Chaim and Fifi, their three daughters, Miriam, Judith, and Hadassah, Miriam Judith's future husbands, who are our fathers, and my paternal grandfather, all from the Netherlands. They became the 8 narrators of our book. These 8 narrators come from 3 families. This is the D'Souza family. The adults are my maternal grandparents, Chaim and Fifi. Before they had children, Fifi was a nurse and director of a children's hospital. Her friends were artists and writers. She often participated in feminist causes. Chaim was a pharmacist who was interested in philosophy. He was required to work as a military pharmacist in the Dutch East Indies in return for the military financing his education. The 3 girls were born in the Dutch East Indies, which is where this photo was taken. The D'Souza family returned to Rotterdam in 1936. This is a photograph of the 3 girls shortly before the German occupation. On the left is Hadassah, in the middle, my mother Miriam, and Judith is on the right. From the Geismar family, one of the narrators is David, on the left. He's my father. David and his parents emigrated from Germany to the Netherlands. Every summer until 1936, he visited his grandparents in Germany. Here he is with his grandfather, Max. And the other narrator in the Geismar family is David's father, Erwin. Erwin had a factory where he designed and manufactured leather accessories. In 1940, he volunteered as a social worker for the Committee for Jewish Refugees. We learned so much about the social and political situation in the Netherlands during German occupation from Erwin. David's mother, Greta, is not a narrator. She's the other person in this photograph, but she didn't leave any writings. And this makes me think about the importance of documentation and evidence and leaving a story. In the Cohen family, the only narrator is my uncle Natan. But from Natan, we learn about his parents and sisters. His father was a general practitioner. In 1939, all three families welcomed German Jewish refugees into their homes. In the case of the Jesuita and Cohen families, they each fostered a girl the age of their children. I'm going to show you just a few of the things we found in the drawers. In my mother Miriam's drawer, I found a miracle. It's this document written in German, which I don't speak, but fortunately my husband Rob does. After reading the first page, Rob turned to me and said, "This is the memoir that your paternal grandfather Erwin wrote while he was in hiding." I knew almost nothing about Erwin. On the first page, Erwin writes, "Why do I begin just today to write on the day that has brought me the most personal worries of the last 3.5 years? Most likely because I am alone with my thoughts and worries, because I no longer have my daily occupation, because my domestic surroundings are dissolved, because the chance to commit my entire being to help my family and myself has been taken from me. Perhaps, too, the helplessness in which I find myself, condemned to sitting still, the unaccustomed quiet." And Erwin tells us why he decided to write. "In the end, I hope that my lines will be read by people who will see how we struggled under terrible circumstances, and that the reader will want to take up the struggle that we have fought and experienced from the front lines for the construction of a worthwhile, humane society." Erwin began writing on July 21st, 1943, in the Amsterdam apartment where he was hidden, 2 days after he sent his 13-year-old son, David, who's my father, to a safer address. 6 weeks later, Erwin was captured by the Germans, and on November 19th, 1943, he was murdered in Auschwitz. Neither my mother nor my father knew Erwin's memoir lay hidden in an envelope with my grandmother's papers. My father died 3 years before we found it. For me, bringing my grandfather and father's voice back together is the joy and sorrow of this book. In my Aunt Judith's drawer, we found her yellow star. She was almost 10 years old when she went into hiding, and she wrote about that day that she had to leave her parents and sisters. After arrangements were made, our parents told my sister and me, "Go to Uncle Keith's, but before you reach his house, make a stop and go under one of the bridges on the way and take off your jacket with the star and leave it there. Once you reach his house, he will take care of everything." Under the bridge, I took off my jacket and put it in the bag I had with me. At that moment, I didn't realize the danger of keeping the star. I kept it a secret, realizing I had disobeyed my father, and put it in a book I loved to read. Judith and her sister Hadassah left home together, but they went on to separate hiding homes. This letter by my grandfather Chaim was in Miriam's drawer. It's addressed to his 3 daughters, written 5 years after the end of the war. After it was translated, we knew it was a guide of sorts to make sense of the world after the Holocaust. Chaim draws from the Bible, Buddhist texts, Jewish philosophers, scientists, and writers. We continued to find things for another decade. Many of our findings led to more questions, so there was a lot that we searched for, and other information seemed to find us. In the piles I brought home from the Holocaust store, I found a typed translation of this note written by my mother, Miriam, to her parents when she was a child in hiding. I thought to myself, if there was a translation, there has to be an original. So I went back to my mother's house to search the Holocaust drawer again. When I didn't find the note there, my mother revealed that there were more papers in her bedroom. And indeed, there were 2 tall piles on her dresser where I found this beautiful fragment. In her note on this fragment, Miriam reassures her parents that she's okay, describing her cozy bedroom. But from Miriam's account, we know that that quickly changed. Miriam wrote about the sleeping arrangements. When the Germans started to unexpectedly search homes for hidden weapons, hidden Jews, and hidden pilots from downed airplanes, a friend of the family came to make a hiding place under the kitchen floor. He made a trap door and then put linoleum over it. You could crawl in it. 2 mattresses were put on the dirt floor. Every night at 7, for the remaining years of the war, more than 2 years, we said goodnight, and the 4 of us went down into our little night prison. We were not allowed to talk out loud when we were in there. You never knew who was above your head in the kitchen. When Miriam says the 4 of us in this excerpt, she's referring to herself and 3 other Jewish children who were hidden in the same home. Miriam didn't know the other children until they were hidden together. When I discovered the bedroom piles, I also found 4 loose pages from Fifi's diary written on the infamous date of April 23rd, 1943. I knew from a letter that my grandfather had written that this was, in his words, the day every Jew had to disappear. Both Chaim and Fifi wrote about their desperate need for a hiding place on that day. This is a detail of Chaim's account. On that date, after having already had 7 different hiding addresses, Chaim and Fifi didn't know where they would spend that night. And this was the first day they met the Reverend Brillenberg Wirth at a mutual friend's house, and he found them a short-term address. When they had to move again 6 weeks later, the Reverend asked his sexton to prepare a hiding place in the church attic. And then, to the Reverend's surprise, the sexton told him that he had actually been hiding another Jewish family in the attic for a year. The 2 talked about it and agreed to prepare a second attic for Chaim and Fifi. They all thought it would be maybe for a week or 2 because the situation, the accommodations were so grim, but they stayed in the attic for 2 years. The last year and a half in hiding was the most difficult for the D'Souza girls. It was too dangerous for resistance workers to deliver letters between the hiding places, so the girls didn't know if their sisters and parents were alive. The new wife of the man who was hiding Hadassah didn't know Hadassah was Jewish. She had been told that Hadassah was her husband's niece. So she sent Hadassah to stand in line for food at the Gestapo headquarters. This family received extra ration cards to go and get food from the Gestapo because they were Nazi sympathizers. Miriam was sleeping under floorboards. Everyone was suffering from lack of food, so Miriam was sent to beg for tulip bulbs and sugar beets from farmers. Judith had to leave the home where she was hiding with 3 older women because of increased raids in the neighborhood. Her new hiding parents had 8 children of their own. There was enough food because they lived on a farm, but in this house, Judith had a different horror to endure. When my Aunt Judith realized our book would be published, she made the difficult decision to share her complete story. She had written about it with plans to leave it for her 3 daughters to read after her death. You're looking at the back of a photograph of the couple who hid Judith. The image on the front shows them receiving recognition for hiding her. At the bottom, in Judith's handwriting, you can read the crimes of the father and his 2 sons. This is an excerpt from Judith's letter to her daughters. The last family I was hiding with was where it happened. The father and 2 of his sons, 16 and 17 years old, abused me. There was nothing I could do and nobody I could go to. I never told my parents. Years after, Poppy submitted their names to the righteous list in Yad Vashem. And sometime later, they sent us a letter with pictures of the ceremony in the Israeli consulate where they got a medal and a certificate and trees planted in their name for saving a Jewish life. In 2016, Judith, her daughters, and I requested that this person be removed from the righteous at Yad Vashem. He was the opposite of moral and virtuous. I met with the director of the Department of the Righteous and gave her Judith's written account. The Yad Vashem board and a judge reviewed the case, and his name was removed. Judith remembers having this bear with her throughout her time in hiding. When I left Israel for the Netherlands in 2016, my cousin Sharon joined me. We picked up photographs, went to archives, met with helpers, and visited hiding places, including the small town of Ghent near the German border. Ghent is in the area where Operation Market Garden took place in September 1944. And Ghent is where Sharon's father, Natan, was hidden together with his parents, two sisters, and their foster sister, Gertrude, the German refugee who lived with them before the occupation. I love this photograph of Natan, taken shortly after the war. It reminds me of Paul Strand's compelling portraits of the same time period. Initially, Natan's family split up to go into hiding, but 6 months later, Theo van Dalen, this policeman, and his wife, Betsy, invited the entire Cohen family to hide in their home. Throughout the occupation, Theo enacted brave and sometimes even humorous plots to sabotage the German war effort. In the aftermath of Market Garden, Theo and Betsy's house was bombed and miraculously all survived, but Natan and his family had to quickly find a new hiding place. Natan's entire account reads like an adventure story. Here's a short excerpt. The Germans shot down bombers and fighters over Holland. Theo must have had good contacts with the Dutch underground because that winter he had more guests, Canadian, English, and American pilots on their way back to England. I practiced my English and my chess on the poor downed aircrew members. We also kept war maps, which we prepared ourselves, first tracing them from the World Atlas and then enlarging them by scaling. We had two different lines of pins for Russia, sometimes hundreds of kilometers apart. One where the Germans said the front was, and one where the BBC said the front was. Eventually, I had a treasure trove of stories from our extended family. When I started working on the manuscript, I formed an advisory group. They offered advice and assistance in myriad ways, and the regularly scheduled meetings helped me to keep on track. We met after work and always had great snacks. A first step was to translate two major texts by each of my grandfathers. Irwin's 49-page memoir was translated by my husband, Rob, as mentioned earlier. The handwriting, the whole thing is really beautiful, but incredibly difficult to read. As you can see, the letter forms are just like loop after loop after loop. So first, Rob transcribed the handwriting into typed German, and then he translated from German to English. When Rob was translating, he understood what happened in a way that he had never experienced before. He described it as being in Irwin's head, in Irwin's language. He said that Irwin no longer was one of 6 million. He wasn't anonymous. It was even more of a challenge to find the right translator for Chaim's extremely esoteric and philosophical 70-page letter to his daughters. But eventually, I found Marjolein de Jager, who translated Chaim's words in a way that is true to his voice. As with Rob, Marjolein came to know Chaim intimately, describing him as, I quote, a fascinating man with an amazing brain and heart. Thanks to both translators, I was also able to get to finally know my grandfathers. And I think I can thank them both directly because I think both translators are here with us on this Zoom today. This shows just a few of the other things in the archive. The final narrative was created from over 50 primary sources. In addition to cataloging the physical documents, everything was scanned into a digital archive. These are scans of Chaim's 13 letters to Yad Vashem. some are multiple pages. The digital archive contains scans of all of our original documents as well as the typed transcripts. The digital archive also contains images broken down into family groups with dates and captions for each image. After everything was translated and transcribed, I read through all the accounts and realized that no one person had the complete story, but somehow their collective accounts made it whole. So I cut up everyone's accounts, created content groupings, and then sequenced the groupings and excerpts within them to create a single narrative. This is my first draft. When I sat down to read the interwoven voices, it was like my family members were talking to one another and to me. It was the most emotional moment in making the book. The multiple views provide a nuanced sense of the German occupation and the many different experiences in hiding. It's not an oversimplified version of what the war was like. For the first time, I understood the absence of humanity, the horror of what was done, how it was done, and what it was like for my family members. And I put my head on the table to weep. As I pieced the narrative, I was curious about the people, institutions, and events mentioned by the narrators. So I researched and read about them and then drafted history briefs with a writer and so these briefs are included in the book. There was no precedent or template for this book. For over 3 years, I worked with 2 extremely skilled and sensitive editors, making our own rules as we went. For a long time, we had more questions than answers. As I collected, selected, and borrowed photographs and artifacts and held them in my hand, I wondered how to present them so readers could fully appreciate the beauty of the originals as I was able to. I worked with a photographer who shoots for art museums to digitally capture the photographs and artifacts with a real shadow to give them dimension. And finally, in December of 2019, just before the world shut down, I went to Italy for the printing. And after 14 years, we finally had a book. The book is 248 pages with 63 images and 64 history briefs. It's slightly oversized with a trim of 8 1/4 by 11 3/4 inches. The typeface is Kiwi, designed by Michael Abbing. He had sent me the complete Kiwi family after seeing a book I designed. What I love about this typeface, especially for this book, is that it's a contemporary and clear sans serif with forms that are inspired by the classic old style faces. It's simple, beautiful, legible, and doesn't distract. After I designed Invisible Years using Kiwi, I learned that Kiwi is Mike's mother's maiden name, and she's Dutch. The content, design, and number of pages a book is going to be is an interdependent puzzle, and one that I love solving. Here you can see the sections, word counts, image counts, and page count, all based on the working design. I designed hundreds of covers for this book, and these are a few of my favorites. The first is my father after the war, and I think his face says it all. The problem with this cover is that it's one person, and Invisible Years is a family story. The second is the lining paper from the Holocaust drawer. I think it would be fitting for the entire cover to be wrapped in this inside and out, and possibly with a cloth spine. The third is Chaim's drawing of the hiding place with typography that gives a sense of the chaos. And the last is a silhouette of Judith's bear, foil stamped into cloth with colors close in value because the bear is in hiding. And this is the published cover. The end papers of the book are the lining from my mother's Holocaust drawer, and they're my favorite part of the book. Each chapter opens with an introduction and a timeline. Robert Jan van Pelt, a Holocaust scholar and leading authority on Auschwitz, wrote the chapter introductions and foreword. He also fact-checked and added to the history briefs. The timeline summarized what's happening at parallel moments with the narrators, politics, society, and the war. I've highlighted a few of the juxtapositions in this timeline for the chapter titled Separated. So if you see up at number 1, the 3 Dezuta girls first go into hiding on August 19th, 1942. At number 2, their 4 cousins are murdered in Auschwitz, also in August and also September of 1942. At number 3, 3 months later, the Allied powers released their first statement that the Nazis are carrying out Hitler's plan to exterminate the Jewish people. This is one of my earlier designs for the timelines. It travels from left to right, like time moving. The narrators' names are highlighted in addition to the dates. I think it's beautiful typographically, but I decided I wanted the timeline to be really legible. I didn't want the reader to have to turn the book, and I wanted it to fit on one page. The chapters titled Before, Trapped, Forbidden, and Separated are organized by family grouping. This is the Dezuta section of the chapter titled Before. And here you can see the multiple voices as the conversation changes between Miriam, Judith, and Hadassah. And the outside margin here and throughout are the history brief callouts that they're side by side with related references in the personal narrative. And the names of the narrators, which you can see better in this image, are purposely typographically quiet. I didn't want them to interrupt the flow of the narrative or to compete with other information that often joins the narrative. For example, on this spread in the outside margin, you can see that there are 4 history brief callouts in small caps and bold, and also 2 notes that clarify some details in the text, since the text is taken from these diaries and letters and written accounts, that it sometimes needed clarification, and that is in the regular weight. And then in this chapter, titled Forbidden, the anti-Jewish decrees are interspersed throughout the narrative. This is an older design, and here the history briefs are on the page with the narrative at the bottom in a different weight, but the same size, because I didn't want them to be treated like small footnotes. In the end, I decided to put the briefs in the back matter so they don't distract for those who want to read the narrative uninterrupted. And another difference in this version is that the excerpts that go with the images are large. And again, I didn't want them to compete with the images, so in the final design, they're much smaller. This is also an older rejected idea. Here I'm exploring the possibility of including a full bleed pattern behind the full spread or full page photographs. These patterns come from the old photographs, the old photo albums from my family, but I opted for a clean, simple, and more modern approach with the emphasis on the photographs. This is the map that opens the chapter titled Invisible when everyone goes into hiding. It shows the hiding addresses of the 8 narrators, the names of those who helped, and the date range of the narrators' stays. And the map flips out to show the hiding places in the east. In total, the map shows 27 documented hiding addresses for 8 people. An older idea was to have the full map as a large fold-out in a back pocket with a small version printed on the page as reference. The inspiration for this idea came from the book in which I found the map, titled Netherlands. It's one in a series of 30 geographical handbooks that provided extensive information to Allied commanding officers in the countries in which they were fighting during World War II. As I mentioned in the earlier chapters, before, trapped, forbidden, and separated, the narrators' voices are interwoven, and forbidden includes the anti-Jewish decrees that the Nazi government implemented. The decrees are interspersed through the chapter as the narrators collectively tell how their lives are destroyed with each discriminatory law that stole their property rights and freedom. And in the chapter titled Invisible, when the narrators are isolated in hiding, they have separate subsections where each tells about their unique experience. So this is the opening of the subsection for Judith in the Invisible chapter, where it's just Judith's story. When the narrators are liberated by the Allies in the chapter titled After, their voices come together again. And the image here is one of the many letters that my paternal grandmother Greta received from the Red Cross in response to her search for her sister after the war. It took 22 years and many letters for her to finally receive confirmation that her sister was murdered with her entire family in Auschwitz. Of the 8 narrators in Invisible Years, 7 survived. My mother describes how happy she was on Liberation Day when, I quote, 5 years of horror were over. But she quickly realized, and I quote again, there were many more sad days, weeks, and months ahead, and that for many people, life never really returned to normal. When the war was over and they came out of hiding, they learned that 61 close family members were murdered, their mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. This list remembers them. It contains the names, relationships, ages, and dates and place of murder. Most of them were murdered in Sobibor and Auschwitz. I'll end with these words of thanks that my grandfather Chaim wrote about those who helped him and his family. When the war was over and we were free once again, days of great happiness arrived. It was as if life itself had been put back into our hands, for our very life had been stripped from us, which is to say, from European Jewry. And it wasn't because we deserved it that death passing by us so closely had spared us. Gladness and gratitude overwhelmed me. Gratitude to all of those who had supported us during the war years, and an emotion of thankfulness that for now I will call divine. But this feeling was almost immediately stifled, remembering just one of the millions of cases where the children had not returned. Surely countless ones among them must have been 1,000 times more deserving than we. And here are the Jesuita girls shortly before the German occupation. Thank you so much for listening.
Breathtaking. Daphne Geismar, my goodness. I knew it would be a beautiful book, but I want to say we're going to open this up to questions. We have about 15 minutes. My grandfather was a pharmacist too, by the way.
Really?
I've worked on many books. I taught a class called Visual Biography. The idea of working with found imagery and evidence is finding a needle in a haystack on the best of days. What is so remarkable about the many remarkable things in this book is the degree to which you have both been inside and outside. You have given voice to all of these family members, brought in experts, used your skills as a designer, wept on the table by listening to their voices. I mean, it is really an unusual tour de force to be able to be both editor and assembler and chronicler and memoirist. I want to ask one question and then we're going to open it up to, I'm sure, many more. What has been the response from your family members?
This response has been wonderful. Some of them were involved in various aspects of the process. Those who weren't, I think, were completely surprised. We all only knew the very outlines of our parents and grandparents' stories, or for some of them, really nothing at all. So it was really wonderful after my siblings and cousins, and then especially the next generation, our children, read the book and have this history for themselves and their lives in whatever they do. Yeah.
We have some questions from our participants here. A number of people I think are interested in how the book is being explored and received as a piece of education in schools. Are you giving lectures? Are you sharing what you shared with us today with other people and with other institutions?
Yes, I've done a lot of Zoom talks throughout this last year. The book was published really a year ago, May 2020. And the talks are primarily to Jewish organizations. So it's nice to be talking on a design platform to other people. and um, and I there is a lot of interest in the book, and I think in ways that will just have it bring greater awareness. So I am working with a museum educator to create educational material, and we have a few scheduled workshops, and that's sort of our goal to connect not just with the Jewish organizations, but public schools and other groups to give educational programs on the book. I'm working on, I received a fellowship from Yale to work on a documentary short based on the book. And I'm working with two amazing young women who are filmmakers, and we are hoping that the film, well, our plan is for the film to be of interest to teenagers and young adults. So it's not going to be a typical Holocaust documentary. There's a few museums that are going to be exhibiting the work, and it's going to be published next year by Random House in Germany. So so all of those things. So so there's sort of in exhibitions, film, education, and we're hoping to connect all of those things and also do them separately. So it's really an exciting time to kind of, my hope in deciding to put this out there rather than just keeping it a family book was that I think this book is not just for Jews, and I think there's so much to learn from it about humanity and lack of humanity for all of us. And so I hope it is able to be shared more widely.
We do too. Victoria Solon has a question. Victoria, would you like to ask it yourself?
Sorry, my camera is covered up. But I was interested in the manuscript advisory group that you formed, who you put in it, whether it stayed stable through the whole process, and how you found working with them as co-authors, especially if some of them were friends and family members, which it sounded like maybe they were.
The advisory group was great. One of my clients was working on a huge ongoing project, and she told me she had put together this advisory group, and I took her idea, and they were really, so there were about 7 people on the advisory group. They were a combination of my colleagues from the museum publishing world, a couple of family members, friends who are artists who were just really passionate about the story, a friend who was sort of had more expertise in like the business publicity side of things. Sarah Jamshidi, who's here, was on the advisory group for a short time before she moved away. And Had it been during COVID, we would have been doing it on Zoom, and then you could have continued. So they weren't really actively involved in either the manuscript or the design, but they were kind of like a sounding board. Oh, and then also Stephen Nairn, who is the director of the Fortunoff Archives for Holocaust Testimony at Yale. He was also on the advisory group, and for the second year, and a librarian, an arts. There was a librarian who also was the librarian for the Art of the Book Room. So it was a really wonderful group, and mostly it was just people who at some point had said to me, we really love this project, and if I can help or be involved in any way, let me know. So I was working along on the project, and having the meetings with them acted as deadlines of sorts, like presentations that I had with my clients. Otherwise, my own work would get pushed to the back burner, and and it would never get done. And so we met for those 2 hours, and some got involved in helping me put together the first website, and some made, Stephen connected me with Robert Jan, who is the historian who was involved. So so they were sort of more advisors and sounding board, not so much really working in any detailed way on the material.
Emily's question is certainly a question I've had. Emily, would you like to ask this yourself? It's an excellent next question, I think, for Daphne.
Sure. Hey, Daphne.
Hi, Emily. I was just reading your question.
Yeah, so I'll just dive right into it. I'll skip over the niceties that I start with because the book is amazing. I've had it now for about a year, and I always return to it. And so, of course, it's highly collaborative, right? You mentioned all these people that you worked with. And so I'm wondering if you could detail some of the challenges in the process of making the book. And did you ever have moments where you think the book was just impossible, that it was too big or like too much, or you'd work on it for the rest of your life? Like maybe you'd finish it, maybe you wouldn't. Yeah, let us know.
Yes, there were so many challenges. I have a secret list that I keep of disasters that happened in the process of making the book that I'm not sure that I'm ready to share. But over the 15 years, with each phase there was something. And so it started with the translations, which is a lot of these pieces were I just designed books for other people with their material, so a lot of this was new to me. So I had never worked with a translator, or had I never managed the translations, and that proved, that was the first real difficulty, because I had this huge letter in Dutch that was 70 pages from my grandfather Chaim, and the first page a friend had translated, and on the first page it was that excerpt that I ended the talk with. It was really, really wonderful. So I thought all 70 pages would be like that, and so I thought this was going to be the core of the book, and it would mostly make up the book, and I couldn't do anything until this was translated. And not to get into all the details now because we don't have time, but it was kind of a disaster with the first translator, both in that he would translate a couple pages, and then I wouldn't hear from him again for months, and then he would translate a couple pages. And like with all of these disasters, I have to say it's really remarkable when something seems to not be going well and is very frustrating and very difficult, but then you step back and think, there's something wrong here, there's a sign that this isn't working. So eventually I had to cut the cord with him because it wasn't happening, and I looked for a new translator, and I found Marjolein, who's here. And not only is she a remarkably skilled translator, she's the most lovely person, and we became friends during the process, and she came to love my grandfather. And it was such a difficult manuscript to translate because it was really philosophical and scientific, and there was a lot of literary references, and a lot of people said, I have a degree in philosophy, but I'd have to go back and re-educate myself to be able to translate this letter. So I think Marjolein did it in, was it a month or 3 months? It was a very short period of time. 3 months. and I think you turned it in on like Holocaust Remembrance Day or something. And there were a lot of situations like that where, I set down on one path, and even just in the process. So do I have time for another tiny difficulty that has to do with the design, Jessica?
Yes, you do.
Okay.
Except that Rod, before we leave, wants you to explain the Paul Rand sketch and why.
Oh, okay.
So make sure you make time for that. We have about 3 minutes.
Okay. So just quickly, a lot of it had to deal with, all these other people that I was dealing with and things not going well. Or I flew all the way to the Netherlands to get one photograph. And when I got there, it seemed I wasn't going to be able to get it. And so things like that. But in the design process, I mentioned that the first chapters, the voices are interwoven. And then when everyone goes into hiding, the voices are separate, and then they come together again. I spent I did this test with the interwoven manuscript, and we read about an hour, and everyone took a voice at my advisory group. And we realized the power of the interwoven voices and decided that that was definitely a good way to create the effective way to create this manuscript. Of course, it could have been a separate chapter for each person. There's so many ways it could have been done. So I was really excited about this idea of interweaving their voices, and I just went chronologically, and I had half the book sort of edited or written. And then I got to the chapter where everyone goes into hiding, and it wasn't working. I was interweaving their voices, and it wasn't working. And I kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. And because I had done half the book, and I was getting to the point where I thought I'm going to have to give up on this idea because it's not working here. And then I realized, of course, their voices can't be interwoven because they're separated from one another. They're in isolation, and they're having completely different experiences. And what's so wonderful about the interwoven voices before is that you hear about the same experience from multiple perspectives. But that needed to not happen. And I really kind of beat myself up because I always tell my students and my clients, that you really need to focus on the content and let the design grow out of the content. And I wasn't doing that myself until it took a month for me to realize I had to listen to the content. And now it's a really wonderful thing that the voices are separate, and then they join together again when they're liberated. So those are a few of the many challenges. We'll go and have a beer at the new brewery in Bridgeport, and I'll tell you about that.
I can't wait. I can't wait. Thank you, Daphne.
Last question for Rod. Daphne, tell us a little bit about the sketch, and then we'll let you go.
So I was working on this identity design project. So we were talking about logo types, and we were also talking about the Holocaust. I can't remember why. And Paul said to me, I've always had this idea in my head. If anybody ever asked me to design a symbol for the Holocaust, I have it. And I said, what is it? And so then he sketched it out. And of course, it was the number 6 million, and the zeros are made up of the memorial candles that you light for someone who's died or been murdered.
Oh, the yard side candles.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes. I thought it was a menorah, and then I realized we were one digit short, which he would have known.
I know. I don't think
I was never good at math.
Well, now we can
now you all know why.
Critique Paul's Paul's design.
Yeah, I wasn't there. He would appreciate being mentioned in this conversation in any context. Daphne, thank you so much. You are the gift that keeps on giving, and this book is just a treasure. We all look forward to receiving our 20% discount. Go to the bottom of the chat. You can see the link.
Top of the chat.
And I put it again at the bottom.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So much to think about, and very moving, and of course, very powerful visual work. Thank you also for sharing the design strategy and studies with this audience who I know appreciated every word. Thank you, Daphne.
Thank you so much for having
me.
me.
Enjoy your summer, everyone.
So nice to see you all. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Be well, everyone.